Hello and welcome to another episode of Teaching Heroes, the teaching podcast where I ask educators and leaders, what does it take to turn up every day and teach tomorrow's leaders? And today I am the absolute privilege to have on my podcast the chair of epidemiology at Deakin University and many university award-winning teacher as well, my favourite epidemiologist and yours, Professor Catherine Bennett. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast.
Thanks, Jo. Pleasure to be here.
And I just started to think over the last couple of months with the education podcast, it'd be really great to expand teaching pedagogy to not just talk to teachers and those trained in teaching education, but to also expand the thinking. And particularly, I've been talking to STEM educators as well. And I know that's an area that's really lacking in terms of teachers and people, and careers and jobs, and expanding more diverse people in STEM to talk to you about your experience working in epidemiology and how you've developed and discovered your teaching as well along the way.
Look, it's an interesting question. I think I've probably always been a little bit of a teacher. I get excited about ideas, and for me, they're only kind of real if you're sharing them. And so you kind of I process my thinking out here a bit, and so actually a classroom is fantastic if you've got other people who are really interested. And so I probably gravitated towards that path early in life. I did train in basic sciences rather than medicine. I was expected to do medicine, but I actually was fascinated by a whole lot of other things and wound up going down the population genetics, osteology, physical anthropology pathway, and microbiology, which was a love, infectious diseases.
Yeah, right.
And there were elements to all of that which were about applied statistics, but also about problem solving, which was how my brain was wired. Yeah. And so that's how I kind of got into the field. But, right from early on, I'd have work experience, people working with me. I got involved even when I was working with government for a time. I worked on the Sydney Olympic Games in heading up the epidemiology, the public health response in Northern Sydney. But I'd still make time to do tutoring at Sydney Uni, in the medical program or whatever, because I just really find the energy you have in the classroom really, a great way to kind of see the future, be working with the people who are the next generation of researchers and people working in the field, but also who have some really fresh ideas and fresh questions. It keeps you fresh. So it's a win-win, situation. Yeah. So I actually made the decision to come back to university formally at the University of Melbourne after I finished working on the Olympics, and had a position there as a lecturer, and then worked my way up and moved. And part of the reason was because I've been doing lots of teaching and teaching into things and guest lectures, it was so lovely to be able to take a subject on board so that you could actually look at the bigger picture, not just a drop in with some content, but think about how you tie that teaching and learning process, how you work in partnership with students, how you come up with authentic assessment and all of those other elements to it, which I enjoyed. And then ultimately went on to course leadership, which was even better because you could think about how it all came together and do really ambitious things that linked content and deeper learning across subjects so that people could, come out of a course with a key set of applied skills. Yeah. So my area is very vocational in the sense that people are often motivated to work in public health. Yes. But it can also lead to people down research pathways as well. So you get quite a mixed cohort of students, some already working in medicine or nursing or other allied health areas. But you'll also find people from economics backgrounds or policy or legal, who actually want to move into the space and apply their skill set in the health context. Yeah. So it's mainly taught in postgrad, though I teach into undergraduate programs. My experience has been in postgrad. And so it was about thinking, well, I can't do this on my own. I'm going to develop partnerships. And that became the theme of my teaching. And whether it was with industry partners and employers and health departments, trying to figure out what they needed in graduates and asking them into the classroom so that we could work with students, or I'd have my students present to them. But most importantly, it was the partnership with the students. And I talked about these sort of learning partnerships as a critical part. And the nice thing was, after many years at Melbourne and building courses and new courses and reviewing programs, I was nominated for an award, which ultimately had me nominated beyond the university to the national award. And when I won that and shared it with my class, one of my students said, you know, and this sort of proved me to be right, that this is what it was, but he said, "This is fantastic. I feel like we all won it with you." And that was actually the perfect response, because they could see how much, you know, we would be in the room and we'd work through this together. And so it was lovely having really lovely student feedback and so on, but it was more that kind of message. And watching these students take on complex concepts and be able to turn them into a practical knowledge and practical skills, which was so fantastic. So, you know, loving what you do, but keeping that love alive, because you've got this wonderful interaction has probably been the story of my teaching life.
Amazing. I have so many questions from all of that. One that is one of the ones I'm thinking about is that in teacher education, we're very much mandated by, you know, the federal government and the state government departments of education about what we teach. There's not a lot of flexibility in what are in our programs. And is it like that in the sciences and in something like microbiology and in epidemiology? Is there a kind of mandate, or is it more that the university and industry are working together, like you're saying, around, well, what's needed in our workforce? And so there's more flexibility there in terms of content?
It's a bit of both, and it varies subject to subject. So in some areas, like introductory biostats, while I say, you know, I am teaching the postgrad level, and that's true, you're actually teaching undergraduate level content sometimes, because you're teaching the introductory that everything else builds on. So there's quite a few things you need to build into that. But that said, you know, in the old days, that would be, you know, just, oh, that's what you teach. You teach this regression method, this, you know, whatever, and you go through this set list. And I did that initially, and I tried to contextualise it. We always try and tie it to our own research or really good applied examples across a range of different areas, so that someone with an interest in infectious disease control isn't doing stats on, you know, designing car parks or something, which is, you know, sometimes what happened in my training.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, it was when I was invited to develop the Masters of Public Health program and the biostats teaching within that for our Indigenous cohort here at Deakin. Even before I came to Deakin, I was invited to do that. And that made me think about it really differently, because I realised it's all about the learning outcomes. And it's a little bit like we're starting to move away from lectures even at that time.
Yes.
And someone wise had said to me, you know, the average person takes 3 things away from a lecture, or whatever the magic number is.
Yeah.
If you teach them 1,000 things, they choose which 3 they take away. You know, key, core, you know, hard learning. If you work with them on the 3, then they not only get those 3 right, but you're also all in agreement about what the most important 3 things are. And it was a really interesting kind of challenge, because it made me stop and think, what do my students know at the end of a class? What do they know at the end of the semester? And more importantly, what do they know 6 months later, or when they're in the workforce? And so you could still be true to the learning objectives, but you could be more realistic and say, you know, if I have to teach the principles of probability and how we apply them in probabilistic statistics, is the best way to do it to teach them 5 different statistical methods, 3 of which they'll probably never use again in their life? Or do I take up the challenge and try and find more meaningful ways to convey that, using 2 methods that are more commonly used, but really come at the understanding of probability? So it's not about repetition, it's about something else. And the Indigenous students I worked with were fantastic, because the other sort of thing you get lulled into as a teacher is you kind of, when you have that built curriculum and you followed a set formula, you sort of think people learn A, then B, then C, then D. And you're concerned about B and C, because they won't get D unless they've got B and C, and B and C won't happen unless A has been really well grounded. That's the sort of linear view we have. And I would work with these students who'd be a mix of fantastic people of all ages, coming back from, maybe from Aboriginal Health Services, sometimes community leaders, very different backgrounds. And you'd be working with them, we'd all get through A, but some of them just wouldn't get B or C. There'd be something about it that just challenged them. And you could sort of see them pull back. And we kept going, they kept going. And we'd come to D, and they could get D without C. And sometimes D helped them understand C. And I suddenly thought we probably sort of think hierarchically in learning in a way that people of different cultures will do things differently, and not everyone is going to be linear, and not all learners will be linear in the same way. And so I just thought we don't have to kind of try and hold everyone up and get everyone to that level. Actually, if they stay engaged and you can keep them engaged, there's a good chance that people will come and reconnect with the learning as you move through. And of course, since then, we've probably moved away from certainly a download lecture. It's much more about people being able to navigate their way through online resources, even if you've got on-campus teaching. So I do think there's more scope now to play in that space. But now I understand why that's really important, because everyone's learning styles we know are different, but even learning sequence and how they process some of these concepts.
Yeah, and thank goodness that there's more of an appreciation of that now as well, that we're not trying to fit learners into one model, but rather we want to encourage those different learning styles, because we as teachers then learn, as you're expressing, we then learn about our own teaching practice and our own understanding of knowledge through that openness to the different learning styles that are in the room.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, it can be challenging for a teacher. And I know at the time when people were being asked to step out of a lecture theatre, and not offer lectures, and we started to move into that flipped classroom thinking, there was a whole lot of stuff going on there, and there were people that were really anxious about it, because they felt, they were the most use when they could just stand up there and share their expertise. And this turned it on its head. But I think for me, it was a natural space, because it was that thing where we'd have the problem on the table and we'd be all bending over the table and working on it together. And I think one of the things that a lot of people missed, I think, in some of the old style teaching was how much you can learn from the teaching. And if you keep it live, keep it dynamic, put new problems on the table that you work on with your students, you're much more likely to challenge your own thinking and keep your own thinking moving, rather than going into output mode and saying, well, what I've learned now is what I share, and maybe tweaking it a bit each year. But, I certainly saw some lectures that were presented to me as a student that looked like they'd been rolled out year on year, So I think it's a challenge, but there's a lot of reward in that as well.
Yeah. Do you think your approach came from your experience in practical, in the kind of in the actual workforce, like working in public health in New South Wales and Victoria? You were able to apply that real world experience so it was a more natural process for you, do you think?
Yeah, I hadn't come up the normal academic pathway, going straight from my PhD into a fellowship and then starting to pick up more teaching as part of that. I taught as a PhD student, like we all did, but that was mainly pracs and tutorials. So as you move through the practical world, you do think about learning in a different way, particularly, as I said, when you're in more vocational areas where you just sort of think, that's really interesting. I was never taught that, that's going to be good. How do we teach people to tabulate data? Because you just assume everyone knows how to do it, but it's a skill in itself, and there's some shortcuts to the learning that you can help people with. So it inspired me to think about some of those practical things. But I think you're right. I think coming back to university, I had a freedom that came from not knowing what was expected in a way. And I was given lecture content to take over a new subject, and I started on the Monday and the first lesson was on the Wednesday. So I didn't have lead time. But the good thing was I was presented things which was just a photocopy of kind of overheads, the olden days. So these were obviously already overheads, reasonably tight. So anyway, I wound up taking that content and what I've been doing quite a few conference presentations or presentations to other people in my public health unit. And so I just put them into a slide format that was my conference format and put a bit of work into it. And the students loved it because they felt like they were at a conference. They felt like they were being treated with respect, they would tell me. In fact, that was interesting. The Indigenous students in particular loved that they had what they saw as quite professional and polished slides, because I just a black background, I'd think about colour, I try and use images. Yeah. Whereas some of the other academics at the time said, "What are you doing?" Because the students are going to be really unhappy with my class now. Thanks, But it's actually you're right. It was what I knew, and that was the sort of education world I'd been exposed to in recent years, was the conference circuit. Yeah. And so dropping that sort of content in and then encouraging the questions and the conversation around it meant it was sort of an easier transition. But I do acknowledge it's harder if you've been brought up in the old style lecture tutorial mode to make that shift. So it was a bit of an advantage to me.
Yeah, I think I keep trying to go back into primary schools in particular to ensure that my teaching is up to date, because I do find that schools can be a little bit ahead of the game. And so I ensure that, I'm doing the latest, teaching and learning styles, or I'm just keeping my, the muscles, strong, so I don't get complacent, it is very easy, particularly when you've been at an institution for a long time, to get out the old slides that you've been using for years, and it takes something to really ensure that, okay, I'm going to adapt it this year, because teaching pedagogy, brain science, it's all moved on, and so therefore we need to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's easier to do that if you fundamentally think you have to do it, rather than it's another job in a busy life, that I've got to update it. What am I going to put in this year? It's taking those things you've thought about over the last 12 months. And I would learn every time I offered a class, and even I offered the same class over 6 years, and I was worried I might get stale, but I never came close. And every time I'd come back from a lecture, no matter what time I finished that day, I would sit there and I would write notes into the PowerPoint itself about what I wanted to do next year. Wow. And it was sort of a gift to self, because then when it comes of time around, you think you think you'll remember, but you don't. And so you just find these ideas that came out of the class, that came out of the conversation with students, that are about better ways to explain something, or became clear they weren't getting something with the way it's presented, so just replace that, think about that again. So it was just a really nice practice to get into, because you didn't have to do it there and then, because you usually don't have time, but it just gave you a roadmap for keeping it a bit fresher each year. And of course a lot's happened since as well, so particularly my world is ridiculous now, because I do research every single day, multiple times a day, to try and stay on top of what's happening around the world. So this year, and I've always, even though I wasn't teaching running courses and classes, I've kept teaching, all my academic life. But I wound up having a sorry, my phone keeps ringing.
Fine. I'm sure it is going hot, Catherine.
It is, but I can't remember what I was saying now.
Updating you're doing daily research.
Yes. So we wanted to put some COVID into the program, because everyone's immersed in it. But you have to be really careful, because where it's content that relates to people's immediate life, and also their anxiety and concerns, and the disruption that's happening to their own world, particularly their university world as well. We had to try and manage that quite carefully. But when something like this happens, it's an extraordinary experience, because a lot of people gravitate towards this kind of area to want to know more. But at the same time, they've got a really sophisticated understanding already of the phenomenon. This is now trying to come at that in a way that gives them the theoretical frameworks and the structure to the way you think about it and how you process it, rather than taking them in a classroom, giving them theory, and then trying to flesh it out and get them to use it or imagine how it can be used. Here it's sort of almost reversed, which is fascinating, but has its own, I guess, challenges as well. People probably think they know a bit more than they actually do. You got to bring them back and pare it back, but that's a great starting point in a way.
Mark Humphreys, I don't know if you remember, did a skit about the armchair epidemiologist.
Yes.
And it spoke to me, Catherine, I have to say. I was like, that's me. I am the best armchair epidemiologist. But you're actual. I just pretended. But I wondered, like Ian Lipkin, who was the advisor on Contagion for that movie, he says that what he didn't expect, like he was asked to reflect on, being a part of a pandemic now. And one of the things he said was that he just expected the government to do what the scientists said, that they never imagined that there would be a response, and I guess this is particularly in America, a response that would just kind of ignore the pandemic or have, different theories. So I wondered whether, particularly in the teaching of public health, have you had to change or alter any of the teaching in terms of the real world kind of not responding necessarily how you would have predicted?
It's hard to know, really. I mean, I've addressed that quite directly because there's a bit of a divide in epidemiology. Some people say it's not our province to advocate or even to advise necessarily. It's our job to produce the unbiased, objective data on which decisions can be made. And in fact, I know Mary Louise McClaws, the other epidemiologist doing a lot of work in this space, said the same thing on an article that talked about our experiences over the weekend that came out. Yes. And she also says, it's our job to present science, or was it Sharon Lewin? But, there was that sort of sense of it.
Yeah, I think it was Mary McClaws.
Yeah. So it is something about, and people have debated that quite seriously, whereas other people say, no, we have to, even if you're not handing the data over, you should be collaborating in research so that it's what we call co-creation of research, and so that you're answering a question someone out in the community or in policy making positions or whatever wants answered. You're answering the questions that matter, and you work with them to figure out what that is, and then you bring it back. At the very least, if there's data out there, you do have a responsibility to help translate it, to help put it into a format people understand. But ideally, you work with them from the start, and it's actually a partnership. Yes. So it's a more active involvement in the way I see epidemiology and the contribution. That said, there was a lot that went on. Someone used this talking about something else completely, but it was perfect language, because I do think epidemiology in particular, but science generally, became weaponized during the pandemic. And whether that was, it played out very differently in different countries, as you say, but, it could be a screen. People could say, we have to listen to the science, but they never showed the science, or the science they showed didn't really seem to match the policy decision or the settings. And so there was a whole lot that was going on that's really difficult. But I think it's really important, because that's the real world. It's not about we find the answer and you make it happen. We see it all the time. We have a lot of people here at Deakin who work in the food space, so food policy, healthy eating, all those things that are drivers of unhealthy eating, and they're very complicated, and we live in a world where people say, kind of at the end of the day, it comes down to personal responsibility. And in fact, that went out in public health in 20 years, 30, 40 years ago. It became the no word, because in fact our environment, our social, our physical, our economic environment, all of that is built in a way that actually drives your decisions, and people don't realise that. And so what we saw in this pandemic was a bit of that trying to happen, where in fact policies which were put down to science were more about trying to control people's behaviours and almost experimenting with what would contain movement, or at what level could you police something. So you had to kind of make it sound like it was science, but all it was really trying to take some of the settings to a level where the police could actually monitor. And I just think you might need to do that, but you should be honest about the way you do it. And so I did call those things in the public space, and the students are interested in that, because I didn't stand out in front of Parliament House with a banner, but I asked the questions. And I was concerned that people would start to not value science if they thought it was dodgy. If they couldn't see the link to science, or they thought, if science is telling you that, that's weird. You know, we heard that science was behind decisions that meant during our lockdown in Victoria that you could play in a park, you could play cricket into a net, but you couldn't in the same park hit a tennis ball over a net. That was not allowed. Yeah. Cricket was allowed. Oh, really? And you're using the same ball, same bat, you know, more so in cricket than... So there was no science to it, but they would say the scientists have made the call, and that's how it is. So it was really trying to get the balance right between not undermining what we're trying to do, because public health interventions matter. That was a tension, because the other side of it was where it was, you know, epidemiology was just being wrapped up in politics, and trying to detangle that a bit so that epidemiology wouldn't then lose value, wouldn't lose credibility.
Yeah, and I can imagine that would have been so difficult for you and the other public, you know, people doing public media, because, I mean, you know, New South Wales and Victoria are kind of that example of just different health responses, and both states say we're listening to the health advice, or both states say they listen, but their responses are completely different. And so it's kind of this, you know, war games in Twitter land anyway, around which responses is what.
But the answer is, in a pandemic, you do whatever you can in a rush, but then we keep doing it because we say it was a success, but we haven't actually evaluated it.
Yes.
So my call is for evaluation. And in fact, I was really pleased to hear Sharon Lewin, as head of Doherty, saying exactly the same thing. Yeah. You know, if the states are doing it differently, it tells you there's a bit of give in the science, you know, that we don't actually really know. Yeah. And our tendency in Australia has been to go for harsher, bigger, longer, broader lockdowns or whatever. Rather than, not talking about Sydney at the moment, that's a different situation, but but it's built up, whereas places like New Zealand, which started with more serious and lockdowns than Australia, we all achieved the same effect. They looked at Australia and they thought, okay, we can pare back a little bit. If we need a lockdown, we'll just do it locally. We don't have to go, you know, island wide every time. Yeah. Whereas Australia, who was equally successful but had the second wave in Victoria, went the other way. And so while New Zealand was becoming more nuanced, we were becoming more extreme. And so it was interesting, because that's where you say, actually, let's use our own data and learn from it. Yeah. But, you know, if you don't do it at the time, you can still do it after. And in fact, you must do it after, because that then informs next time. Yeah. So I think that was, to me as a scientist, the biggest difficulty is saying, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying, like circuit breaker lockdowns. Yeah. What I'm saying is that it's an insurance policy. It didn't come into the case the way it played out, because in fact everyone was already quarantined, so lockdown didn't change things. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't have it, but we need to do the research to say, you know, address the what ifs. What if that person was more infectious? What if you know, this had happened differently? You can actually say, well, now you've got the data, do the what ifs, figure it out, see whether that still would have been a threat. Yeah. And if not, it might make you more confident next time to not go to lockdown if it's not actually going to add something. Yeah. Or you know what the triggers are. So it sort of sounds simple, but in fact, for some reason, we've seen very little of that. And I've been involved in a lot of parliamentary inquiries. Oh, yeah. Two now, and one Senate inquiry, that are trying to do some of that unpacking and going back. But in fact, what you need is the epidemiologists, the people in the health departments, great people there, but supported to do this really important work. Yes. So that we learn from every outbreak, rather than saying, well, that worked, you know, now move on, you know. Yeah.
And move to a more uniformed approach, like what can each of the states learn from each other about what worked and what didn't work, as you say, from that scientific point of view. What's the different strains, you know, excuse my unscientific brain here, but the different strains seem to be, some are more infectious, some are more deadly. What are the different states' responses? What can we learn from each other about each of the cases? And as you say, which worked and moved to this. I mean, I think from a public health perspective, there seems to be a need, I think, for a more federal, you know, response to these outbreaks, so that there's consistency across the states. But I don't know whether we've gone too far.
Yeah, look, I do think it's difficult, because you never become as aware of being a federation rather than a country as you do in these sorts of situations. And we've long had challenges with the divide in health coverage between the federal and state governments, because it's sort of not always clear who's responsible for what, like aged care.
Yeah.
So I do think there's a lot that we can learn from this, and I think already we've seen some really important positive legacies, and that's also an important part of, you know, thinking about this and working with students on this is actually unpacking it and saying, we could never stop this happening. There are certainly things we've learned about it, though, to prevent future pandemics, but mostly we've learned, I think, more about how we need to respond and how we need to invest in our public health, because we pared back on that. And I think that's a big lesson too. But there's so much. I mean, the way scientific communities have worked together, the free access to journal articles related to COVID, just shows what's possible when you have this sort of global disruption. It's been incredible.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's, you know, could be brought out more in the public domain, is that, you know, vaccines weren't quickly produced. It's just that there was this investment, this time, this money investment in vaccines. That's, you know, what you get when you invest in the sciences. That's the outcome.
But it is then the translation of my teaching, my interest in teaching.
Yes.
But not wanting to sound like a teacher. And I think that's where it's nice, because most learning happens in a conversation.
Yeah.
And it was something I learned very early in life, again, working with people in the Indigenous community.
Yeah.
But I heard someone talking to me about a particular issue to do with quite a complex issue in the Aboriginal communities. And as they were talking about it, because they'd been to, you know, some big meetings around this with the community, and they were just talking about something, and it was saying something that had happened, which actually happened at the time. It was something like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, but they thought it had happened 3 or 4 years ago.
Right.
And it actually made a difference, because something bad that happened 2 generations ago is something that you can say, well, that should never happen again, and this is why. But if you think it actually happened 3 or 4 years ago, what's changed, you know, in that time?
Yeah.
And so it was quite interesting, because I thought, if I had asked her, do you know when these events happened? She would have said yes, and our conversation would have been over. Or if I just talked about it, assuming they knew, or started talking about it happening 30 or 40 years ago, they might just question you and say, well, I don't know, as if I don't know what the date is, or just think, well, that's wrong, that's different, and switch off. But in hearing her talk about it, it was a great way to then open up a conversation. And I thought, as a teacher, one of the key things, no matter what level you're working with, whether it's small children, bigger children, adults at uni, you're actually so much more able to communicate if you understand where their thinking's at. And so that building conversation into teaching has been so critical, particularly for me, because I've got people coming from very different backgrounds. But just to try and get a sense of that lay of the land, and then figure out where you go from there, rather than making assumptions about what people do and don't know. So that whole conversation. So working in the public domain, people coming to you and just wanting to help, to have help understanding what the numbers mean, and why you can't just read every number if it's as if it's the same meaning, because numbers change depending on your screening or your testing or whatever.
I have to say, I have loved that as like someone who's trained in sociology, to say, see, science isn't as like black and white as you keep thinking it is.
Absolutely.
Always up to interpret. A 20 in Victoria is different to a 20 in New South Wales.
Absolutely. It's the story behind the cases, as I said. So there's absolutely a lot of that. And sometimes there's commentators too, scientists, that have a very strong opinion, and they're not necessarily talking about the data specifically, they're kind of putting out their view of how you should respond. And then people are getting information at all different levels and trying to, and the media do at times to absolutely try and find people who have opposing views. And I think sometimes they have to work very hard to do that. And I don't think that's helpful if it just makes the community think that there's disagreement on the same issue. And that's actually not that common. And there might be a difference in view in how extreme you need to be in certain measures. But at the end of the day, there's more agreement than disagreement. So that's actually quite frustrating. But anyway, there's that whole thing again about working with people and understanding what it is that they struggle a bit to see, and then trying to work with them to unpack it. And it's the same with the media. I spend a lot of time working with the media behind the scenes, so that the key reporters who worked on COVID a lot thanked me for that, because it just helped them get a little bit of a bit of an understanding, so that they didn't always feel like they were shooting in the dark and have to go to an expert. They could actually start to look at the numbers and see what was going on themselves. And I think that sort of empowering of people,
yes.
you know, giving them a bit of a key to starting to look at data in a different way, that was really, you know, I think an important part of what I could contribute, but also one of the very satisfying parts as well.
Yeah. Was that just something that you like, where did that kind of calling come from? When did you start to realise that, that this is something that you could contribute to the dialogue?
I was involved very early in COVID. I'd worked with a reporter late 2019 on another story, which was actually, interestingly enough, sewage water surveillance, EPI. And at the time, people didn't know much about it. It was in use because they used it to monitor things like drug use and things in the community. And I was in Denmark on a bit of a sabbatical, and it was actually an Australian reporter, which was doing a piece for the BBC in London. So it was this sort of weird connection around the world to do this story. But she approached me in February last year because COVID was becoming a thing, and so she wanted to do a piece on it, and she came to me and I helped her set it up, because at that time one of the key issues was we didn't have coordination, coming to your point. And so that was a bit of my theme. And then she went out to all the sort of leading infectious disease people around the country, and actually when she said to them, Catherine thinks blah, you know, everyone said, yeah, you know, coordination is what we need. So it wound up being a starting piece, which is actually more about the governance and how we work together. And then it went from there. It was a bit, you know, I'd get asked to do stories on various things early on when we started to see more cases in Australia. But by about June, it picked up to something equivalent to a full-time job. And then very quickly by July, it could become a 7-day-a-week. You know, a job. By September, it was 100-hour weeks. And it hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped. And I thought it might ease over Christmas, but of course we had the Sydney outbreaks before Christmas, and then just when it looked like it might slow a bit, we had the Victorian outbreak, you know, in February, and then it just picked up after that, and it's actually been bigger than ever, because we're starting to come at those bigger conversations about opening up and how you manage now with the new variants emerging, and we're talking about the vaccine and the vaccine rollout. So
what a contribution you've made. Really, I don't think people realise how, you know, how extensive, you know, the contribution has been from yourself to that dialogue, and what it takes for you to, you know, not only just give your commentary, but to ensure that what the public is getting is, you know, what they need to know, you know, kind of balanced based on science.
But you also have to, I mean, the misinformation out there, the disinformation as we call it, you know, the deliberately seeded false information to undermine, whether it's a vaccine program or lockdowns or whatever, it's more than malicious, it's vicious, you know, and it's very strategic, and there's a lot of people investing a lot in it, and it's really hard to counter that. But again, you have to be aware of it enough to know what's being said, so that you know how to try and present credible truth. In fact, well, the facts as we know it, we never really know the truth, on the table in a way that might challenge someone's thinking if they've already had this sort of information. Because otherwise, often it's quite clever, and it's set up in a way that no matter, if you then put facts on the table, they've already got a counter argument, because that's built into the wrong information that they've been given. So one of the classic ones you hear a lot is that, you know, lockdown's not necessary. This is not a serious illness. We have, you know, 910 deaths. We normally have that from flu anyway. In fact, we didn't even have that last year. And then you say, that's right, but we had 910 deaths because we had the interventions in place. Like, you can't use the fact that the interventions worked as an argument to say we didn't need them. Because if you didn't have them, you'd have 14,000 deaths or whatever, you know, the model is saying. So it's sort of this weird logic, and you have to be really thoughtful about how you respond, because the people telling you this aren't the people that came up with it. They're not the malicious people. They're the people who've bought it somehow and have had it presented in a way that they think then challenges their understanding of what's going on. So if you can provide information, bring some of those people back. Occasionally I meet people who I'm sure know at some level that what they're saying is absolute rubbish, but they're very vicious and persistent, and will do whatever it takes to get that point across. And I don't think it's just because they think it's the truth. I think because for them it comes at something bigger, like I don't want lockdowns and I don't care if old people die. They've got very simple views of COVID and they'll do whatever it takes.
Even from fear, like their businesses have stopped trading, they can't understand why they can't open.
And you can challenge whether we're doing things in the right way, but to pull back to the extreme positions of we must stay in lockdown and do it forever. And if we have one case now, we should go into lockdown, which, believe it or not, is what some people are saying. And then you've got people who say we should never go into lockdown. This is ridiculous. This is just a mild disease, which is not true. Yeah. And so you just end up with people at the extremes, confuse people in the middle. Some of those gravitate to an extreme because that seems to be the loud voice. I stayed in the middle, and I at times would be saying things that asking questions that had people writing to me as an anti-masker, because I was saying I don't think we need masks outdoors now, and if we don't have masks outdoors, people might wear them indoors for longer. So the anti-maskers would attack me because you shouldn't have to wear them at all, and the pro-maskers would attack me because
you should be wearing
them. We should wear masks all the time. And I said, well, I don't know what it adds, but and so it stifled the conversation in the middle.
Yeah.
And in a way, again, it's like teaching. Teaching, you've got to steer a line down the middle. You have your own views on things, but where they are opinions and views and stances and beliefs, you've kind of got to pull them out of the picture and make sure that you are able to talk about things in a way that isn't layering it. I don't want everyone to leave the room thinking what I'm thinking. I want everyone to leave the room knowing what I'm thinking about and having had a chance to contribute to that thinking. And I think they're fundamentally different things, but that's the other thing you get from the classroom. It's actually kind of understanding your own lens on things. And I get it from, I have a big engagement on LinkedIn, and that works quite well because you do get people from whole different areas of business and law and government, and so it's amazing the people that come onto that site, public health workers, people doing contact tracing, everybody. So it's great to have that access. At times it's tough because people, you get people who are just rude, but, just hearing what are the current conversations in the disinformation space that do come and land on my side. I think you just have to be across that as well, or else, you're missing half the conversation and you're just talking over here and it's not responding to what's happening over here anyway. So
I never thought of it like that, having that, actually welcoming some of that disinformation just so that what it is you need to counter in that public space. I hadn't really thought of it like that.
Yeah, and I listened to some of the videos that are sent and so on, and it's actually quite scary, and these people, some of these are medical practitioners, mainly, from America, I must say, the ones that I've seen, so it's only a slice of it, but it's quite shocking to have people that are medical practitioners speaking to things that are outside their area of expertise and actually fundamentally misinterpreting information, but thinking they're right, and that's very compelling to someone who trusts doctors and sees that they're really authentic, about their belief in what they're saying, that it's quite confronting. So, but you have to be aware of it, because otherwise, you expect everyone to kind of know, to have listened to someone who looks like a crackpot, saying crazy things like, oh yeah, of course that was wrong, you're right. They're not. They're going to go, well, actually, these really legitimate looking people, qualified people, are saying these things. Who do I trust? Or do I just trust no one because it's all competing information?
Did you find students coming to you then with all that disinformation too? Did they treat you as a kind of trusted source, or did you get some pushback from students, or how was it in the wider university?
I didn't have my own classes. I'm just starting a new class now, so I didn't do that earlier on because I couldn't. But we did have classes, and so students certainly did ask questions there, and some of them did touch on these issues. So again, there are people who are aware of them in the community. I think if you ask those questions in class, you're probably at the very least going to present them in a way that sounds scientific. You're not going to kind of come at it like someone does on LinkedIn, or worse, Twitter. But I don't engage in social media. You can't, and that's a pity. And those places you just don't have the resource that other people do to invest in that sort of thing. So but I do think, certainly for staff and teachers in other units, and I've taught into other teachers' subjects, that's how I've been involved in the teaching. It's been interesting because people will come and get advice. The university gets advice about how we open up as a university.
Yes.
Other people come, staff, colleagues, to get personal advice on whether they should travel for the holidays.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And of course, you don't have all the answers, but all you can do is, I guess, tell them what the variables are, and they can figure out for themselves how they juggle, that risk as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So what next then? So beyond, the pandemic's going to keep going, I figure, until vaccines are more effective, and it's going to be ongoing. But what has this experience as a public figure and as teaching, what does this mean now for public health and the teaching of your degrees going forward? What can we learn from this experience?
Look, I think one of the things, and media have said this themselves, one of the silver linings in the pandemic from their perspective is, and he started to say, the emergence of, female experts, particularly in STEM. Yeah. But then he stopped himself and he said, no, because they always had female scientists they could go to and ask about a thing. Yeah. But this was different. He said, no, female public figures.
Yes.
Who can speak, to the content. And so I think that's been something I've been very proud of. It's like people would call me Ms. in stories. Yeah. And when you say chair in epidemiology, so that gets translated to chairperson.
Oh, no.
It's sort of funny, but at the same time, I didn't grow up. I grew up knowing I didn't want to be a medical doctor, but I love medicine and biology and all the rest. Yeah. So I didn't really know what I wanted to be, but being a professor wasn't on my radar because I didn't have an image of female professors in my head. I'm sure that, it happened to a lot of people of my generation. You just sort of, wasn't that I discounted it, and I wouldn't, if you asked me, I probably wouldn't even verbalise it, but that subconscious thing that you didn't see female professors. So I thought, I'm proud to be a professor, and I like it when people use the title because it makes people think that's possible. And what I love about it now is when I walk in the street, people walk past and say, hi, Prof.
Yeah.
Morning, Professor. And I love that because it's being a professor, it's something that people can aspire to, which is a senior academic career, but it's actually about being an accessible academic, which wasn't always the case in the past.
Yes.
So it sort of brought the prof into the real world in a way, which makes people hopefully think about it as a career, but also makes it relevant, to the world in a way it hasn't been. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. I do get requests for media about other things, not a lot of the time because COVID still so dominates. Yeah. And there are probably ideas about, how you communicate things, or now with my incredible network of, connections in the media, there might be times where, you take ideas to the media. Yes. It might be about other but related issues. So I think we haven't really explored where this might go, but it is new. It is new to have this sort of level of commentary, not from health experts in the media. We've got people like Norman Swan who've filled that space well for years, but now it's something else. Media itself has changed, journalism's changed, resourcing of journalism's changed. Yeah. So actually having people who are comfortable in that space but not necessarily tied to a media organisation, they're not beholden, they're not on a salary, they're working with the university as a public good enterprise. Yes. But able to move in and out of the media space. I think that's an interesting place to be in terms of communications.
And a real opportunity, to have your expertise on COVID and beyond. I know it's not just in infectious diseases, your research profile is, quite varied, and a real opportunity to get that, amazing research out into the community.
I think it changes the way we think about translation. But with it, there's also, I get asked to do a lot of presentations now. I've collaborated, I've provided advice to industry, parts of the hospitality industry, art galleries, sporting groups, a choir group, in Perth. And that's fantastic, because that's this sort of co-creation of research that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And if you set up those partnerships and now you're a bit more visible and people come to you with those questions or those ideas or those propositions.
Yeah.
And you also, I've been privileged to be asked to sit on a lot of plenary panels, and they can be for people who work in the biosecurity space or people who work in medicine. And so working across a whole range of groups.
Yeah.
And being involved in plenary discussions, you're involved in the really big picture discussion. So it takes health out to the world. And public health has always been a very multidisciplinary area.
Yes.
And so it's just, we think in systems. So you can't just think of a health response in isolation. I know everyone says, you know, you do look after health first and then everything else follows and our economy will recover.
Yeah.
But in fact, health is woven into the fabric of our system. And if you tweak something over here and you put someone in isolation, something changes over there. Someone doesn't get their elective surgery, or someone else has a mental health crisis. But maybe they get better support than they normally would because we've built a structure around mental health support because of COVID. Maybe not. Yeah. And so there's all this stuff going on that you need to understand. So actually having these panel discussions with different satellites within that system is an incredible privilege and opportunity. And it's how you feed into those conversations and hopefully maybe link some of those conversations up so that you can, you know, think bigger about these things and do the evaluation we need to do in that broader context. Yeah. That, I think, is the legacy.
Absolutely. And I think you make me think of an article Professor James Avanatakis wrote recently about the need for us to, you know, be more interdisciplinary and to, you know, in universities to move away from this silo approach, because and to reimagine what a university is, to not just take ourselves for granted as well, that we deserve whatever, but actually to prove our worth and to, you know, show that we can network with organisations, with public health, and that we need to be interdisciplinary. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has proved that, you know, time and time again, that, as you say, it's not just the health response, but what's going on for business, what's going on for the individuals, what type of health are we talking about, physical health, mental health, all those things need to be considered. And we, you know, universities have a real opportunity here, as you say.
And I think that's absolutely right. And I do think that, you know, at the end of the day, we've tried to do more interesting things with KPIs for universities, even in the research space, and to look at translation, but we're always a bit awkward about that. Yeah. It's just like, well, how do you measure translation? It's too hard. Or you have to do a narrative or whatever. And I think this has just actually opened it up in a way that says it's not that hard. You know, when something big happens, you can bridge the university with whoever you need to. And I'm proud to be at Deakin, because Deakin takes partnerships very seriously. It's part of the thing that attracted me to Deakin 12 years ago now, that is this genuine, you know, working with community, trying to make that community's worlds better because they are part of a partnership with the university. But at the same time, this has just got me very excited about, you know, that we could move yet again in terms of how universities are seen and how we kind of cross over into all the parts of the bigger world that makes the universities relevant in this and gives them better and newer opportunities for how they contribute. So taking that expertise out into the world in ways we haven't been able to before, that would be very exciting.
Yeah, that's incredible. Well, Catherine, as Sydney moves into its third week of lockdown, I'm sure your phone is running hot, so I will leave you to do the various media appreciations. Just thank you so much for your advocacy, your media presence. I know that you know, I've been a huge fan, and as many others have appreciated yours and others' commentary. So, and thank you. I just can't thank you enough for giving me an hour of your time to come onto the podcast. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear about your teaching practice, and I'm going to take a lot from what you said. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Jo.
Thanks. That's been another episode of Teaching Heroes, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.